I think, very interesting about federal Indian law is that it incorporates a lot of other disciplines. For example, sociology, economics, and history, probably foremost. And so when we look at Indian law and look at Indian policy, it's very important to understand the historical context that it exists within. And the United States has had various Indian policies throughout time, and sort of where you're at along that timeline and what the U.S. policy was at a given moment is really necessary to understand the rules and the nuances of Indian law. So I'm going to walk through some of that for a few minutes for you. One of the leading professors in the area of Indian law is Matthew Fletcher, and in talking about these periods of policy development, he wrote something I thought that really captured the essence of Indian policy. And he said, wrote, "Federal policy towards Indian tribes has moved in various decades from physical extirpation to measured separatism to removal to assimilation to self-government, sometimes at the same time." And so we'll talk about these as along a timeline in particular periods, but there is some overlap in this. So first, prior to Europeans arriving on the continent, there were hundreds of tribal nations, and each had a unique form of government. And when Europeans arrived, they had a problem. They wanted the land and to establish colonial territory, but there were people and governments already here. So what principles would guide their interactions with these people and with these governments that they encountered? And there's several periods beginning with the colonial period, the treaty era, the removal era, allotment and assimilation, Indian reorganization, termination and relocation, and the self-determination era. And so I'm going to talk about those and rather discreetly in their discrete periods of time. So the colonial pre-constitutional era ran from 1492 until 1789, the formation of the United States. And the sort of the foundational rule there was the rule of discovery. And the rule of discovery was rooted in papal bulls during the colonization of Africa, but was later applied to the colonization of the Americas. And the basic notion was that the mere act of a European power arriving on the continent and planting their flag divested indigenous nations of absolute title to their lands, and they were left with a right of occupancy of those lands. And this right of occupancy of the land could only be taken away in two ways. First, it could be acquired by colonial governments through tribal consent, or it could be acquired through just war. So during this time, acquisition of tribal lands was a governmental and not individual matter. And at the same time, international law recognized tribes as nations. The British Crown and many British colonial governments entered into treaties with tribal governments. And one of the important things that happened during this time was the 1763 Royal Proclamation. Individual colonies had been making treaties with tribes and acquiring lands, and there were issues that came up, a lot of conflicts that came up. around that. So in 1763, the British Crown issued a proclamation that limited the power of colonies to acquire lands from tribes. It also declared that all land west of the Appalachians was Indian country, and the laws of the Crown did not apply in Indian country. So this effectively prohibited colonists from acquiring and speculating on Indian lands west of the Appalachians. And then the next period of time was the treaty era, and this began from the founding of the United States until about 1871. And the U.S. entered into treaties with tribes beginning during the American Revolution. And a lot of the early treaties weren't even written treaties. But 1778, there was the first written treaty, and it was an alliance with the Delaware Indians. And these tribal governments, now the United States has been formed, but tribal governments had actually pre-existed the United States. And once the United States adopted a constitution, the tribes were not part of that constitutional convention. It was the meeting of the federal government and the individual state governments. So tribes remained governmental, but existed outside of the constitutional framework. Sometimes that's referred to as extra-constitutional tribal governments. And the U.S. Constitution itself vested exclusive authority over commerce with Indian tribes, and also exclusive authority in the federal government in making treaties with tribes as well. And one of the very first acts of Congress that was passed after the adoption of the Constitution was the Indian Non-Intercourse Act of 1790. And the Indian Non-Intercourse Act said that the only way that tribal lands could be acquired was with the consent of the United States. So again, continuing this government-to-government relationship now between tribes in the United States, and preventing individuals from speculating on Indian lands. And during this treaty period that lasted up until 1871, the United States entered into just under 400 treaties with Indian tribes, and most were peace treaties with land cessions from the tribes, and these treaties were often negotiated under duress, which is why, as I mentioned earlier, the treaties are interpreted in a way that is most beneficial to the Indian tribes. So this period is marked by what some have called a measured separatism, that the United States and the states would exist over here as their own governments. Indian tribes would exist over here as their own governments, and they would stay pretty separate. And the United States assumed this exclusive role in Indian affairs. In 1871, Congress passed a statute that purportedly ended the president's authority to negotiate treaties with tribes. And that's probably a somewhat questionable congressional act because the Constitution talks about treaties being negotiated by the president, ratified by the Senate, so an act of Congress probably can't override those constitutional provisions. But at any rate, it's never been challenged, and it's kind of hard to imagine a situation where that could be challenged. And everybody has followed that statutory provision since 1871. But the U.S., even though it's not entering into treaties with tribes, it still negotiates agreements with tribes, but now they're adopted as legislation rather than treaties. So those agreements are voted on by both houses of Congress. The next period is the removal era, and this lasted from about 1812 until the 1850s or so. And the early 19th century was a time of almost constant conflict between settlers and Indian tribes. And the issue of settlers making incursions onto Indian lands and the state's lack of respect for tribal territorial sovereignty gave rise to the notion that this, quote, Indian problem could be resolved if tribes were removed and relocated to somewhere else far away from European settlement. The idea of relocating Eastern tribes was around in the earliest days of the Republic, and the United States first sought to remove Eastern tribes to land west of the Appalachians, and then later on to remove tribes to lands west of the Mississippi. And in fact, land in the newly acquired Louisiana Purchase was set aside specifically to be a place for relocated tribes where there would never be a state government, called the Indian Territory, and that eventually became the state of Oklahoma. And during this time, after the War of 1812, the United States negotiated a number of removal treaties with tribes, but the process moved fairly slowly, and the settlers' appetite for land was outpacing land cessions from the tribes through these treaties. And so in 1830, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, making removal the official policy of the United States. And at that point, the U.S. moved much more aggressively and much more drastically toward Indian removal. And the removal treaties that were negotiated after the Indian Removal Act were negotiated under really a great deal of duress, and there's all kinds of accounts out there that you can read about where one tactic, for example, of the United States was to find one faction of a tribe that was amenable to removal and negotiate a treaty with that one faction, but that faction didn't really have authority from the tribal government, but the United States would nonetheless move forward as if that were a valid treaty, and the tribe on the other side of it viewed it very differently. And so this really resulted in a lot of factional conflicts within tribes, but also had this result in many instances where you had large numbers of tribal members who just didn't view the treaties as being valid, and then the United States on the other side are ready to use military power if necessary to enforce the treaties and the land cessions in the treaties. And so the result of this was the forced removal of tens of thousands of Indians, and along the way, during those removals, the deaths of thousands of people through starvation and exposure. And the most probably well-known Indian removal was the Trail of Tears of the Cherokees, but there were other southeastern tribes as well that had similar experiences of Indian removal. And the United States was pursuing this policy of Indian removal and forced removal in the old Northwest as well, what's now the area of like Indiana, Illinois, and the upper Midwest. And as the U.S. expanded further westward, continued this removal policy. So the next period was allotment and assimilation, and this went from the 1880s until about the 1930s. And this has perhaps had the most drastic impacts, not just on Native people and tribal governments, but also on how Indian law would be shaped as well. And in 1901, Merrill Gates, who was the chairman of Indian commissioners, described allotment as a mighty pulverizing engine to break up the tribal mass. So in 1871, treaty making ends, and Congress begins to regulate the government-to-government relationship with tribes primarily through legislation. And the various allotment acts that were passed by Congress were the primary mechanism of this allotment policy. And so I'll describe for you a little bit about what I'm talking about with allotment. And but first, I guess the underlying notion of allotment and assimilation was this idea that this Indian problem, this quote Indian problem, could be solved if Indian people just lived like non-Indian people, and if they were coerced and into adopting non-Indian ways, that they would eventually see it as being a superior way of life, and tribal governments themselves would eventually become irrelevant as individual Indians took up this non-tribal way of life. So the policy was to eliminate Indian identity altogether and assimilate Indian people into mainstream society. So some of the ways that this policy was achieved, for example, were the removal of Indian children from tribal communities and sending them off to boarding schools where their hair would be cut. They wouldn't be allowed to wear traditional tribal clothing. They would be beaten for speaking their native language. And then another important piece was the disestablishment of communal lands and forcing Indians into this agrarian lifestyle, and those are tied together. So this disestablishment of communal lands, destruction of communal lands, was achieved through allotment. So I'll explain that to you a little bit, what that is. If you imagine an Indian reservation being this large tract of land, and typically that was communal lands for the tribe, and particular individuals may have a right to occupy a particular tract of land or build structures there or something like that. Lands were held communally by the entire tribal government. And so what allotment did was Congress came in and said, well, we're going to subdivide those Indian reservations, and we're going to make them into 80, 120, 160 acre parcels of land. And each individual or head of household will get their own parcel of land by which to adopt this agrarian lifestyle. They can farm it and so forth. And once all these individuals get their own plot of land, then if there are surplus parcels, extra land left over, then those will be sold off to non-Indians. So through that process, tribes lost about 2/3 of their land base through allotment. And allotment also resulted in large numbers of non-Indians moving onto reservation lands, moving into Indian country. On some reservations, the majority of people living in Indian country were non-Indian at a certain point. And so you might be asking yourself, well, how can the United States do this? The tribes are, Joel just said that tribes are sovereign and that they have this title to their land and they're able to govern their own territory. So how can the Congress just decide that they're going to divide up the lands and give them to individuals. And there were a lot of natives that were saying the same thing. And so one particular case was Lone Wolf versus Hitchcock. And there the Kiowa, Comanche, and Apaches challenged allotment on the grounds that it violated a particular treaty, the Treaty of Medicine Lodge. And in that case, the Supreme Court held that the U.S. had broad authority over Indian affairs, and that included the authority to unilaterally abrogate Indian treaties. And so this allotment era resulted in a lot of doctrinal and jurisdictional complexity, which we'll be discussing a little bit later on. But it's important to understand sort of the setup for how that came about. So the next period of Indian policy was Indian reorganization, and this went from 1934 until the mid-1940s. And even a little bit prior to that, there were some precursors. One was the Merriam Report, and the Merriam Report was the first federal report on the condition of Indian people. And the Merriam Report concluded that allotment and assimilation was a failure, and that it had done little more than dispossess Indians of their land. And at that point, it observed that Indian people were the poorest and worst educated people in the United States. And so to address this, during the Roosevelt administration, John Collier became the Indian Commissioner, and Felix Cohen, who wrote the first handbook on federal Indian law, Cohen's Handbook, was the solicitor there at Interior for Indian Affairs. And so together, they developed the Indian Reorganization Act in 1934. And this was the Indian New Deal. So this was part of Roosevelt's New Deal package. And so they wanted to address these really severe problems that had come about because of the allotment policy. So first thing the IRA did was it ended allotment. And then it authorized Interior to purchase lands for tribes that had been lost through allotment and hold those in trust for the benefit of tribes. And also the IRA allowed tribes to reorganize with more modern structures, and it required that tribes adopt constitutions that would be approved by the Department of Interior. And then finally, a very important piece of the IRA also was that it allowed for federally chartered corporations by which tribes could do business. Because keep in mind, at this point, one of the very severe problems for tribes was that they had no source for revenue, particularly with no land base, almost no land base left. So it allowed for tribes to have these corporations to conduct business and generate revenue. So then the next period was the termination era, termination and relocation. And this went from the 1950s until around the late 1960s. And Dylan Meyer became the Indian Commissioner during this time. Dylan Meyer is probably not a household name to anyone, but you probably are familiar with the work that Dylan Meyer did, because he headed up the War Relocation Administration, which were the Japanese internment camps during World War II. And then he becomes the Indian Commissioner after that, and he comes up with this idea for termination and relocation. And what that policy did was it aimed to end the government-to-government relationship between the tribes and the United States, and to cut off services, cut off appropriations, and ending the trust relationship with tribes, and then finally the extension of state jurisdiction into Indian country, because up to this point, really tribes and to some extent the federal government only had jurisdiction in Indian country. So it sought to extend state jurisdiction into Indian country. And another thing that this policy did was it encouraged and gave incentives for Indians to relocate out of Indian country and into urban areas. And so a lot of these tribes that were terminated, that the government-to-government relationship was terminated during this time, have still not been restored. And a lot of them now are seeking restoration through the federal acknowledgement process that I described before. And then the final period of Indian policy was the self-determination era, and that runs from about the late 1960s until the present. So this is the policy era that we're now in, is Indian self-determination. And sort of the early things that were precursors or sort of prompted the self-determination policy. The first was the Kennedy Report, called Indian Education, a National Tragedy, a National Challenge. And the Kennedy Report, which came out in 1968, concluded that the U.S. policy toward Indians was one of coercive assimilation. And this coercive assimilation had resulted in the destruction and disorganization of Indian communities and individuals. And coercive assimilation had resulted in, quote, desperately severe and self-perpetuating cycle of poverty for most Indians. And a nation that was massively misinformed about the American Indian, his past and present. And, quote, prejudice, racial intolerance, and discrimination toward Indians far more widespread and serious than generally recognized. And one of the other conclusions of this report that I find quite striking is regard to education. The coercive assimilation had resulted in, quote, the classroom and the school becoming a kind of battleground where the Indian child attempts to protect his integrity and identity as an individual by defeating the purposes of the school. And so it really honed in on just how deep the problems with assimilation policy had become, particularly with regard to Indian children. And after the Kennedy Report, a number of other things happened. In 1968, President Johnson made a special address to Congress stating the goal of ending termination and stressing self-determination for tribes. And President Johnson carried this out through several of his Great Society programs. For example, establishing Indian legal services. And then President Nixon takes the helm and continues this move towards self-determination and makes a special address to Congress on Indian Affairs in 1970. And all of this culminates in 1975 with the Indian Self-Determination and Education Act. And what the Indian Self-Determination and Education Act did was it said that rather than the Bureau of Indian Affairs providing services, tribes themselves would have the option of providing and managing services directly to their citizens. And it recognized that tribes were in the best position to govern their affairs and determine their own future. So it was a move away from these decades of the federal government dictating policy to tribes and then making those own decisions once again. And So this has been extraordinarily important to rebuilding the capacity of tribes. This ability to take on what have been previously federal services to tribes and take those on for themselves and provide them has really built an enormous amount of governing capacity for tribes. Now, at the same time, as the United States has been pursuing this self-determination policy for the last 40-plus years, the courts, the judiciary, since about the 1980s, has offered less protection to tribes in many ways. During the 1990s, tribes lost 23 out of 28 cases in the United States Supreme Court.